Welcome to edition 9 of Audiovisual Cultures. This week, Andrew, Shail and I indulge in some post-viewing nerdery after seeing Ready Player One. As well as gushing over 1980s nostalgia, we work through some of the issues that the film presents. We're beginning to make recordings with guests, and there's an open invitation for you to get in touch if you'd like to use the podcast as a platform for your work or interests somewhere in the region of audio and or visual cultures in the broadest possible sense. Even if you're a fan and you don't think you're particularly an expert, I still want to hear from you. Email audiovisualcultures, and that's all one word, all lowercase, at gmail.com, or you can tweet me at PEA Blair. That's pretty much my handle for all the internets. So for now, enjoy the utter geek fest that's to follow. Ready Player One.
Ready Player Two. So Player Blair, where would you like to start us?
How do you know where to start? I think it's probably important to point out that we're not gonna do the film justice.
The DVD with an entire day to watch it and rewatch it slowly, pausing it frame by frame, would be the absolute minimum you'd need in order to be able to do that film justice.
Study it. I loved it. I love anything that's that referential, because I'm from a very referential culture, and I love adaptation in all its forms. I really enjoy all that sort of stuff because I really like the idea as a viewer getting a lot of pleasure out of noticing and getting a lot of references, and I know I've only got a fraction of them from Ready Player One, even though I got loads of them. It's one of those texts that shows you how culturally literate you might be, and there's a lot of pleasure to be drawn from that.
As I was coming out of the screen, and we were of course the last two people to come out of the screen, and there's a matter of pride there. As I was coming out of the screen, I thought, what have we just spent the last 2-ish hours doing? Because, okay, the default is what we've spent the last 2-ish hours doing is following a story, but there are lots of other activities that are involved in watching films. Some more than others with different films, they're in different combinations. And one of those activities is getting references to extra cinematic knowledge, or at least getting references to knowledge from outside that specific film, so references to other cultural works. And that activity was something that it was possible for somebody with that knowledge to be participating in quite intensively throughout that film. Now, of course, it's still possible to follow the narrative, to enjoy the film quite amply, even if you had never encountered any of those real-world films, video games, TV series, comic books that the characters in Ready Player One were alluding to.
That was something we mentioned earlier on today after seeing it, was that there were a lot of references where it really held your hand through them, and it was very exposition-y. There were clunky parts of the dialogue, I felt, where it explained the plot to you pretty obviously, and it was totally unnecessary, but in a likewise fashion it would explain references. There was a part where they were hooking through lots of figures, and somebody lifted up a little robot figurine, and then they mentioned this is such and such from Silent Running, and I have heard a lot about that film, but I've never seen it, so I wouldn't necessarily recognise, and I just know a lot of the robots that have been influenced by that, so the likes of Wall-E and Johnny Five from Short Circuit, that sort of thing, have been influenced by the robots and the creations in Silent Running, but I've never actually seen that film, so I wouldn't have known that. So there's lots of things like that for anybody who doesn't get the reference, and then you can go and seek it out. Then there's lots of other ones where it was a lot more subtle than that, and I felt like there were times when I was the only person in the whole auditorium that was giggling at something.
I was right there next to you, feeling that I was the only person in the auditorium giggling at things. Sometimes you and I giggled together. On the spectrum of how able we were to get the references, as far as the average amongst that population goes, we were above average.
Either that or they just were not showing their cards, other than the usual fistling and crunching going on. It was a pretty quiet audience.
Yeah,
I don't know if they knew what they were there to say.
More guffawing I was expecting throughout.
I just thought some parts of it were hilarious, and just the references to stuff. Normally I'm very strict about code violations in cinema viewing, but there were times when I was like, oh wow, and I couldn't stop myself from reacting, because
Yes.
I was like, oh, it's that thing. And there were times when I just wanted to claw at you and say, oh, it's that, and I can't even remember what those things were, and I thought, oh no, I need my notebook, I should have got my notebook and been writing in the dark.
Sorry about grabbing your leg at that one point, but you know.
But no, it
we
was couldn't resist it, because it's that Back to the Future special moments, and this is a film that we've very much bonded over.
As you mentioned, there's this spectrum of one of the spectrum. There's references where our attention is specifically called to a reference is being made here, and then the other end of the spectrum is very subtle.
Really
and
subtle.
I think we were quite some way along there, because say the Holy Hand Grenade. There's an example. No one says that's from a Monty Python film. And the Zemeckis cube, which is
with
a
the little Silvestri cube, so nice.
Dr. Blair, please explain the Silvestri twinkle.
It's a little bit in Back to the Future where it does a little twinkle in the music.
So it's really high up on the notes on a piano.
It's a really twinkly bit.
And it's
It's
three or
that
four notes.
slightly magical sounding, ooh, timey-wimey things are happening.
It's also at the point when something
It's
quite...
usually a plot point, isn't it?
It's a science fiction thing. So it's where science fiction, it's science, but it's really cool science.
Yeah.
And so it seems magic.
The main character that we follow, Wade, who is called Parzival, and they
Or
call him
Z.
Z
Yeah.
quite a lot of the time. The vehicle that he's kind of built up towards, his vehicle of choice, is the DMC-12, the souped-up DeLorean from Back to the Future. It's just hilarious because in both the Back to the Future franchise and in the Oasis virtual world that's created, those are both creations of this Frankenstein's creature of a car that it physically could never have dreamt of doing, because it was the nightmare of a car.
So the Back to the Future and the Ready Player One version of the car...
The dream of
yeah.
the car, it's the dream of, well, it's the epitome of the American dream, that car. It's this amalgamation of all these different supercars, including the Lotus, the Spirit. It was a car with big dreams, but in reality it was a disaster.
But its fictional equivalent can go well over 80, has great handling, great acceleration,
Can
brakes.
fit many different types of tyres. Whereas, no, it's the clunky, awkward, leaky, breaking down all the time crock of a car.
This is a car which also, I think, people expect to see with all that stuff bolted onto it.
It
With that, all that
definitely-
retrofitted stuff bolted onto
Yeah.
it. And just one thing which I have to say, I have to point this out. Without all that stuff bolted onto it, in Ready Player One, it would do exactly what it needed to do for Wade.
Yeah, because it's not a
Because-
time-travelling car in the game.
Yeah, so why? What?
Because it has to be the cultural reference.
What? That's the thing, is that's now become what DeLoreans look like, hasn't it?
But-
Is all that stuff bolted on.
But did you notice as well the red lights going back and forth?
That was very
That's
cheeky.
from Kit, isn't it?
That's Knight Rider,
From
yeah.
Knight Rider.
Well, I suppose because that's the place on a DeLorean which says DMC, and so the logo had been replaced by another reference, as if there was a problem putting that logo on.
I
there.
didn't quite catch the number plate because it doesn't say out of time, but I think it says Parzival.
It's impossible, yeah.
Yeah, and there's all these things back because it's so referential, and because of Simon Pegg, it's going to keep going back to Spaced, I find. So one of the other, I don't know how subtle it is, but it's certainly a clear visual reference, but you have to know the film. So it's H, or Helen.
Yes.
We find out her real name is, but the character whose avatar is H, she has developed the Iron Giant avatar, and is that in the final bit, but has become a bridge for the others to get over, then is sinking into the lava, and there's the hand and the thumb going up, and that's of course the end of Terminator 2, Judgment Day. That's also an inverted reference to Spaced in a way. I don't know how familiar Spielberg would be, but he's cast Simon Pegg, so I don't know. But there's a bit in one of the episodes of Space where Tim's having an emotional moment. He's going, you know, it's like the end of Terminator 2, you with the thumb and the... So he makes a verbal
Right, yes.
reference to that exact moment that they've made a purely visual reference to.
Another thing to camp out on for a moment is that our two backstory characters in this film are both played by English actors pretending to be American.
Of course, yes.
And Mark Rylance does a better job at that than Simon Pegg. They both do okay.
Simon Pegg's there because he's Simon Pegg and he's become that guy. He's become the geek who is now part of geek culture. He's creating it rather than referencing it. He crossed over that, especially in a program like Space.
On the topic of geek culture, this film overtly and repeatedly champions geeks because there's a motif in this about playing for the love of playing rather than playing for gain. There's a motif about not having the confidence to go out on a date which involves actually touching someone.
The social awkwardness, the social anxiety of being that introverted.
And then there's the geek value of having specialist behind the scenes knowledge about really obscure popular culture items, and the absolute climactic moment is about knowing about the very first time that an Easter egg was ever included in a console computer game from the 70s?
79, I think they said, in Adventure, was it?
So there's pro-geek logic throughout the game, that movie. But then at the end, there's I think we should all be a bit less geeky because doing stuff in the real world which involves interpersonal contact can be rewarding. It was one of those compromise solutions that obviously get quite a lot in films which extol a certain virtue. And I suppose what it was doing was it was championing both of these things over the monopoly capitalism that was exemplified by the IOI Corporation. And of course IOI,
101.
it says it's 101, it's indistinguishable from 101, so there's another set of references there.
I loved the film, I enjoyed watching it so very much, but of course there is the odd problem with it. To point out fairly soon, I thought it really missed a trick in terms of ableism. I felt like everybody had to be able-bodied to be part of this virtual world, and I thought that sort of defeats the purpose of a virtual world where you can be anything. I find it disappointing that there was no... because while there's a conscious diversity in terms of race and gender, and even there are still some issues, but there is a conscious addressing of those things, and there's a narrative about class. But it was disappointing that there's nobody who wasn't fully able-bodied in it when there's so many possibilities with a virtual world, because it's not just that it's virtual reality, it's not just that it's computer gaming, it's you have to be fully able-bodied to fully engage in it.
I was thinking, have they gone for a version of virtual reality where you physically move around in the real world? Have they gone for that for any specific other reason to do with the plot, which would then justify this box of limitations in which people have to be able-bodied in order to function in it? And I can't think of one. One point of comparison is Avatar, and the whole point of Avatar is that the main character doesn't have the use of his legs, and his avatar can walk and run, and so the whole thing's about a body that he accesses that can do what his normal body can't. There was actually no reason why they couldn't have had that version, except that in this version of virtual reality, Spielberg seems to have gone for an opportunity to be constantly cross-cutting between the two story spaces. Whereas if it was one of those story spaces where your real-world user just went into a kind of coffin thing and it was all just to do with their consciousness operating the avatar, no movement at all, there would be nothing to intercut between. His love of cross-cutting has got him into that corner where everyone has to also be able to move in the real world.
Well, there's quite a few gags that come out of that. Certainly at the end, where Wade is still strapped in to the thing and he's the only one left in the game. And then there's quite a lot going on with what's happening with his body and him being thrown around in the van, and what's happening with his character and almost pressing the emergency stop button on everything. But even still, with Avatar, I had real problems with that idea. I mean, I just hate that film with every fibre of my being for many reasons, apart from Sigourney Weaver, who is of course amazing. With Avatar, I just felt like, well, he has to become this. He can't just be a whole person and a wheelchair user. He has to become this other being whose legs work to become a whole valid creature, a whole valid being, and that really annoyed me. And in this, I just felt like you could have done something really interesting with it. You could have at least acknowledged that it's not not just people who have a full use of their arms and legs who are using this thing, but actually it could open up a whole world of interaction for many kinds of different people. In a way, it was disappointing and kind of obvious and inevitable that all of these people, including the Japanese people who were very clearly Japanese and not Japanese descendants who were American, they weren't in Japan or anywhere else in the world. They're all not just in the United States, but in quite close proximity to each other. And it's a bit mad that they all just happen to be in the vicinity of each other and within a few hours reach of each other.
When Artemis texts H and the two Japanese characters, they seem to arrive to pick up Parzival or Wade within about 2 minutes. So basically everyone who...
Yeah, they all live around the corner from each other.
Everyone who's a major player in this global... well, I suppose it's, at the very least it's national virtual reality space, lives in Columbus, Ohio. And there is mention of there being other cities at this point and people gaming in those other cities. I was thinking about whether this film might associate the game with slavery. Initially, when Wade is in the very first scene, when he's, that initial drone shot comes in and meets him, and he's leaving the stack where he lives to go off to what seems to be work, and he's actually going off to go and play the game in a tiny little enclosed space in a wreckage pile. When he's passing all the other, what are basically shipping containers where people live, he's looking into these windows where people are in very enclosed spaces doing things in virtual reality.
That reminded me of Rear Window, because you saw them all through the windows in this sort of travelling shot. So you've got a woman pole dancing, guys doing very masculine things, women doing very womanly things. It was a bit...
Well, then in each of those images, it was him looking in from the outside, from this area of relative freedom, into a place where these people were being constrained, and that's set up, particularly after his introduction, his narration as a first-person narrator, it's set up his being free of aspects of the Oasis. So there's people who go in the Oasis and they do very constrained things. Yeah. Whereas he's the kind of equivalent of a hacker in a very matrixy way. But then he goes to his own little prison to do his VRing. And then in addition, later on, when Artemis is captured and she's got this debt, she has to go into what is effectively a prison to work the debt off. But from exposition that she's given, it's clear that when you do that, you just stay there for the rest of your life. And so there's several instances where Oasis is deemed to be, in its current state at least, is deemed to be a prison. And that when you're in it, there's chinks that represent the opportunity to break out of its constraints. And then I suppose the three keys plot, which is the main thing that drives the plot, is this attempt to try and find these three keys. That represents an unlocking, of course. It represents an attempt to try and either escape the Oasis or escape the constraints that have been built into the Oasis over time. As a kind of reversal of Avatar, it's going from a dingy real world into what's effectively a prison, whereas in Avatar it's going from a dingy real world into this fantastical, colourful, free, really highly mobile camera virtual reality world. I suppose having picked that text as what the film's going to do, it would make it difficult to try and then also portray the virtual reality world of the Oasis as something that was liberating for anybody who was differently abled in any way. So I suppose there's routes have been selected in plotting this film, which take no heed of opportunities for anything other than fully able-bodied people.
I don't know necessarily how you solve the problem. I don't think either of us were even aware of the novel beforehand, so I don't know if it's in that or not. I just know because I heard Steven Spielberg being interviewed last week. Nothing like that came up at all. It's one of those things that's so invisible that I don't think it's crossed most people's minds, actually, is able-bodied privilege and that kind of thing. What he did mention that I found really interesting was that because he himself has contributed so much to 1980s culture, and the film is built on 1980s popular culture, I suppose not just popular culture but cult culture, quite niche areas of culture, and of course it goes post that because of the T-Rex. That's from the 90s, that's not from the 80s. And the King Kong, that seems to be going right back to the start, the 1930s.
I did wonder what Kong referred to, because there's the 33 Kong, there's the one from the 70s.
It was the music they used as well from the original Godzilla films,
yeah.
so that was back in the early days as well.
But then there was really recent stuff in the form of a bunch of the gamers were playing as Halo characters as well. It was one of those, if you did it on a graph of when the references are from, the bell curve in the middle would be from the 80s, but there would be stuff from before and
that's
afterwards.
the main stuff. But he was saying there's a huge amount of references to his films that he's directed
In the novel.
in the novel, so he's actually stripped loads of it out.
Interestingly though, the major cinematic reference which he kept in was to a film that he produced.
Yes, exactly.
It's a way of going...
But he said there's only so much he could strip out. The DeLorean had to stay.
One of these days we'll do one of these where we actually have read the original that it's based on.
I'd like to read it now, actually. I'm quite curious. It's one of those where I'd probably encourage more people to read the book. From what I've been hearing from the reviews so far, is a lot of people who are massive fans of the book aren't necessarily happy, but this happens all the time with adaptation, because they want to see the book they love so much on screen, and it's not realistic because it doesn't translate. It has to be changed, and that was already 2 hours and 20 minutes, and it really could have lost a few minutes here and there. There were parts where I just thought, this is dragging a wee bit now, or this dialogue is not necessary. Get on with showing me the stuff. Like, you know, when they had your man, the bad guy, Ben Mendelsohn, in the chair, and it was actually a simulation.
Yeah.
And you realise it's a simulation, but they explain the whole thing.
And it's done with one character explaining it to another, even though the other character is part of the action
has
and
been
therefore
there the whole time.
Well, it would have been briefed on what was happening well
Surely
before
you
that.
all came up with this plan together. Why are you? And it was a bit Basil exposition-y. At that point, it was a bit silly.
Jolly stuff though. The inception tactic, as it could be known, I suppose, is convincing somebody that they've come out of a simulation, but they're actually in another
still
one.
in it.
Yeah. The We're Still in the Game from Red Dwarf. Although I'm sure that it predates Red Dwarf as well.
You had mentioned Wreck-It Ralph. I haven't seen Wreck-It Ralph, but all the games that are referenced. There's an episode of Futurama where they're all trapped in old video games. They're all trapped in like Space Invaders or Donkey Kong and things like that.
Well, the reason Wreck-It Ralph came to mind is because Wreck-It Ralph is about characters from different arcade games being able to move between the games during their downtime. And Wreck-It Ralph is one of the oldest games in the arcade, and there are much newer games in the arcade, including one that's a bit like Halo and is really shooty. When Ralph actually makes it into this really modern game, there's a moment where he actually says, how did kids' games get so violent? So he overtly spells out the contrast. A lot of the comedy comes from characters from one game meeting characters in other games. And I thought, there's bits of this in here. There are bits of the comedy coming from one fictional trope or character with a set of known traits being juxtaposed with a situation or a set of other characters that they're not normally around. Characters coming in their avatars, and their avatars can be basically anything they want. I think one of them was Marvin the Martian. Did you notice that? He was on screen for about 2 seconds. He was about 2 feet tall.
So many we all missed. I was thinking, I'm not sure, and we'll need to say it again, but I thought I possibly saw some gremlins in the big battle scene.
I saw some Ninja Turtles. That was quite clear.
Turtles. Oh, there were so many. There was the part where Artemis is disguised
as someone.
I can't remember
Warcraft?
who that was. I don't know that. But they did the alien
Oh
bit.
yeah. The juxtapositions going on here were, I suppose, the Iron Giant fighting, was it Mechzilla?
Yeah.
The mechanical version of Godzilla?
Beetlejuice was in there.
One of the vehicles racing in the early race through New York was the original Batmobile.
Oh,
Which of course is a crap car.
Yeah.
It's amazing that was anywhere near the front.
When Z was getting ready to go and meet Artemis at the club, he was doing all these different disguise changes. So there was Bowie, Thriller, Michael Jackson, Duran Duran. He ends up with Buckaroo Banzai. I feel like I have seen that once a long time ago and I can't remember now. They do Saturday Night Fever.
Zombies in the hotel from The Shining.
The Overlook Hotel,
okay.
and that's what the cinema's called that they go to. The Shining plays a huge part. The really in-depth reference, that recreation of this other pinnacle movie. The typewriter, the bits with the floor, the decor 237, the twin sisters. blood coming from the elevator. Because on that as well, actually, you had said earlier about gender. It might be worth teasing out a little bit.
Yeah, I just thought, okay, this is a really self-conscious piece of filmmaking, except about gender. Because while it does go, okay, we'll have one of the male avatars turn out to be the avatar of a female character. And okay, it does go, we'll have our female protagonist, who's Artemis, win one of the keys first before Parzival, even though he wins the two other keys first. We'll have her do that, and we'll have her do it where she does something that the others aren't able to do, and it involves her being the one who rescues the girl in distress. Even though it does all of that, what it still does is at a certain point when kind of 2/3 way mark, Artemis gets captured, Parzival's the one who's still free, and it becomes the job of the boys to save the
job's facilitated by the black woman.
And our black woman is, of course, slightly comedy.
Quite a possibly sexist person. Not that there's anything at all an issue with that, and is the character whose avatar is coded as a black man, quite a big masculine black man, and who is warning Percival about, oh, but Artemis could be a dude and you're falling for this person, what are you doing? So it's quite heteronormative.
There was zero gender fucking in
Yeah.
there, because our one cross-dressing inverted commas character was sexually neutered anyway, so it was just being a slightly different version of blackness as far as the film's concerned.
Yeah.
And of course wasn't a white person being a black character, because that would not be allowed.
Yeah.
Gender fucking okay, passing not okay as far as this film is concerned.
And you have a slight clue because there's a modifier on the voice. Everybody else seems to have their own voice when they're playing, but H clearly has some sort of modifier so that her voice isn't coded female, it becomes coded and muffled and masked, but seemingly male. It is quite essentialist in that sense. There's no fluidity, even though the avatars give you the option for the characters to become fluid. Nobody really seems to take it. There's either that or there's characters who are robots, but even the robots are coded male. The Iron Giant is sort of a male character again. Even the Dungeons and Dragons little characters and all of those things, so many of them are coded male, and there's very few female or non-gender specific.
Well, the extreme maleness of this environment takes Artemis from this mysterious, powerful, very savvy, very able character at the beginning to this character at the end who is the girl who the hero is now going to bite the bullet and kiss. The girl who the hero saves several times. The girl whose decisions the hero overrules. The girl who, I think at one point says, "What do we do now?" in that classic way that women do in basically all TV.
Even though she's actually got it sorted, it's frustrating because she goes to saying that from "don't distract me, don't get in my way" to her needing him and her seeking him out.
Elements of her independence do last into the later part of the film, so let's give this film credit. She is the person who manages to take down that force field around that fortress at the end where the games are being played.
But I thought even with H, even though Helen is coded as sort of nondescript as a woman, but with the Shining stuff, she's never seen the Shining because she doesn't like scary movies. It's kind of funny. At first you've got this big black man, and then possibly she's coded as lesbian because there's the room 237 bit, and that's where in the book and in the adaptation, which the film actually goes into quite a bit of detail about, directed by Kubrick and Stephen King, who authored the novel, famously hated the film. He hates the film very much. He ended up making his own television series as an adaptation. It was faithful. I've never seen it, but apparently it's a disaster because it's basically an unfilmable book. You needed to change things and you needed to lose things because there's just too much, and I've read it and it's, well, I'm not a fan. But anyway, this is the part where in the film at least Jack Nicholson is getting all hot and bothered because there's this naked woman in the bath. There's that moment where H says, well, I'll go with this, because doesn't know what's coming. So there's that slight hint that H or Helen is possibly a lesbian or bisexual. The only people with real sexuality are the heteronormative couple who get together at the end. It's Samantha and Wade.
The racial norm in American films that it calls back to, or that it just reinforces, is the one where it's fine to have a black character as long as that black character is not part of a family or social unit. As long as they're looking looking into it from the outside and endorsing or supporting it in some way, but not being part of it, because the people getting together and forming a family unit, maybe just a couple, have to be just the white people.
And it's the only way that the black person can be best friends with the main white guy is through avatars. It's disappointing a bit as well, where at the very end, when it's Wade and Samantha and the voiceover is telling you that they close off the Oasis on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I think it is, and they're sitting kissing. They're not even out, they're indoors and they're sitting kissing, and she's wearing this sort of fabulous gown, and it's very similar to the one her avatar wears when they go dancing the first time. She becomes coded as sexualized, feminized woman when she had been for the whole film a warrior and a resistance fighter.
Our main female character's journey is from able, independent, savvy leader to dependent, not so able.
Well, codependent, possibly.
So yeah, gender-wise, not splendid.
I was thinking about the child's character as well, because there's a bit too much of a big deal made of because you've got the Japanese characters, and the younger one is 11, and there's such a big deal made out of him being an 11-year-old boy. I mean, of course he's going to be one of the best players ever.
Because he's 11.
Because he's 11 and that's all he does.
What my thinking is, in the book, there's this running set of jokes about him being 11, and he's characterised a lot more and has a lot more dialogue. But that as part of the trimming stuff down process, someone just went, obviously we need to trim loads of these minor characters' dialogue. And that just in doing so, just inadvertently kept enough dialogue to make it so that all that character talks about is the fact that he's 11.
I'm 11, what of it? And there's just people giving him looks. Yeah, I'm 11 and I'm awesome. What are you going to do about it? It's sort of really funny the first time, but then they keep on that and it's a bit annoying.
A way of making that first joke pay off more would have been if the second time that you met somebody and they looked surprised that he was 11. Instead of that, if it could have been him expecting the other person to be really surprised, the other person not being surprised at all.
And they're not arsed, yeah.
That would have been a perfect way to develop that gag.
In terms of other blatant references, there was quite a long bit about John Hughes films, and it was more they were being talked about rather than it was when...
I think his name was Nolan Sorrento.
Yeah, Nolan Sorrento, so Ben Mendelsohn's character, was trying to talk Wade into joining them and working for them and finding the keys for IOI. They were using the references to try and catch each other out a bit. Or he was trying to seem cool and down with kids. These references to what would be really old movies. Movies that were about 60 years old.
So, Breakfast Club, 1984? 5?
Around then, I mean, it's as old as me, so yeah.
So 60-ish years old when this film is set.
Mm-hmm.
So Wade is too young to have been born then. In fact, even Sorrento would have been too young to be born then. So yeah, they're both... Essentially, the fanboy is more knowledgeable about popular culture of his grandparents' generation than his parents' generation is. It really seemed like a story space that permitted people to be really into the 80s even though none of them had been there.
It was weird as well because they seem to have been plugged into these games from birth pretty much, and yet somehow they've seen all these movies enough times to know all the references. So I don't know if it shakes a little bit there.
It may be that you can watch games in the movie, in the Oasis.
Movies in the, yeah.
Well, yeah, we can watch games in the movie. You can watch movies in the game.
That's a good point, actually.
Because that's one thing you can do with VR goggles now, is you can watch wraparound versions of films in them.
I meant to say, actually, when we brought up the gender stuff, it was interesting having seen the trailer for Deadpool 2 before. They had the part in the trailer about putting together a gender-neutral gang called the X-Force. And I just thought that was interesting, you know, to take the piss out of X-Men and be gender-neutral and stuff like that. And then the film that follows all the old tropes and makes attempts. And I don't know if maybe it's coming from the novel, maybe it's an ageing director set in his ways, but you've got quite a few stereotypes still to overcome there. But I do have to say I did get special chills at seeing a T-Rex running about in New York. at the same time as King Kong.
It's funny because a Tyrannosaurus Rex is simply a dinosaur, and Kong is simply a very large gorilla. And yet, because of what Hollywood history has done, a Tyrannosaurus Rex is now a reference to Jurassic Park, the franchise. And a giant gorilla is now a reference to another specific franchise about a gorilla that loves humans, hates dinosaurs, and shouldn't be let loose in New York.
The T-Rex, I think that's a sort of shorthand for Jurassic Park, because it's in the Jurassic Park novels and those initial film adaptations. And this is exclusively the Michael Crichton versions, not the Conan Doyle ones from much earlier. Is that there's discussions with improved knowledge in evidence coming to light in paleontology, the idea that the T-Rex may have been a hunter, because it's probably assumed that because of the tiny arms that it was a scavenger. I think there's discussions in Jurassic Park, the first novel, I can't remember actually if it's the first or second one, but anyway, there's discussions about it being a hunter and it actually seeking them out, and that's why it's so tenacious at going after the people when it's free. And so maybe that's why that version of the T-Rex is something that's hunting and it's tenacious and it's smashing through cars and things like that.
Also, it's now generally known that the T-Rex probably had some feathers, and so the T-Rex we're now becoming aware of is a little unlike the one that's been enshrined in popular culture by Jurassic Park. But that's the one that crops up in this 2040s story space.
And the one in the films is different from the ones in the books as well, because the ones in the books swim. There's different stuff going on with all of the dinosaurs in the books. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, I really enjoyed the Race to New York, but I don't know if it's just me, but I kept thinking about the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, particularly the second one, because a lot of the race was happening along the train tracks and things, and it was very like the web slinging and the train battle with Doc Ock. Visually it was reminding me of that, so again I don't know if it's conscious or not, possibly not, but then again the part with the bridge coming down and everything. But I was looking out because I didn't think that was where the T-Rex goes on a rampage in the Lost World film, and it's San Diego, not New York, but still it evokes those things. Anything you want to say about the music?
Okay, so Alan Silvestri was our composer for this one. Of course, there was 2 layers of soundtrack going on, which is pretty much the norm now, where there was an orchestral non-diegetic score, and there was also a non-diegetic score, which was made up of recognisable songs, in this case from the 80s. There was, of course, the point when Wade used the Zemeckis cube to turn time back 60 seconds, and the music that played was specifically from Back to the Future. You mentioned that when Wade gets out the DeLorean, it comes out again. And when I say gets out the DeLorean, he gets out of his pocket. He gets a little version of it out of his pocket, and it grows. So bits of Silvestri specifically calling back to his own music for Back to the Future, but throughout the rest of it, a very Zemeckis feel, very wonder-struck feel to the music, and in that emotive vein of the composers who work with people like Spielberg, that I'm not going to leave you in any uncertainty at all about what characters are feeling at this point, because you're going to hear what they're feeling. This music is going to be people's emotions pouring out of their pores. There's a time and a place for music like that, and this film, which was very gung-ho and full throttle, seems to be that time and that place. It opened and closed on very recognisable pieces of 80s music, which I suppose is always part of easing you into and then easing you out of story spaces.
Well, you come in and you go out of it just wanting to have a dance.
Yeah.
I felt like it was Silvestri's opus, the culmination of all his work, in the same way that the film is the culmination of so much of Spielberg's work.
Yeah.
It felt like this is the big push, this is everything I've got now.
I wondered about the climax where Wade got to talk with what seemed to be a digital ghost of Halliday, played by Mark Rylance. And it was in a room where Halliday's younger boy self was sitting there playing a console game. Halliday admitted that although he had a very specific ethos about how the games he designed ought to work and what sort of activity gaming ought to be, and that it was something that really deserves people's love, care and attention, it should be something that you only do for a certain number of hours per week. And he's doing this conversation while his younger self is sitting there in the same room catatonically playing console games. the message seemed to be, if you're going to be a lifelong gamer, if you're going to be a gamer, and something like 90% of people under 30 now will identify as gamers, even if they do it quite casually, apparently. The message seemed to be, if you're going to be a gamer, at least design games as well. At least pass it on and get into the craft of doing this. Which I suppose is implicitly Spielberg saying, if you love movies, make movies. Because that's where he came from. It was somebody who was just into film, not somebody who worked on TV and gradually converted to being a film director. Someone who's really into classical period Hollywood films and went, I want to do that too. And did his version of a formula that already worked, did it in some slightly different ways in some respects, but didn't in any way go, oh, everything I'm doing is already broken, I'm going to reinvent the wheel, or reinvent the entire system from the ground up. That seemed to be a slightly critical view of gaming at the end. And also particularly during that scene where Alan, or H, was driving all the other characters in that van through the centre of Columbus, Ohio, and everyone in the streets about them was fighting. Like, there was no one out in the streets who wasn't in VR goggles fighting. And she's looking at these people and going, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. A street full of people, not actually fighting each other, just fighting the air. Streets full of people in VR goggles just flailing around. That did seem to go, this is really weird. These people need to see what they actually look like from the outside. There's good gaming and there's bad gaming ethos, even when not taking into account the film's criticism of the construction of games from the other side. And I suppose on the question of the film's criticism of the gaming industry, there's good gaming, and good gaming is where your character has lives. So if you die, you just lose a life off a little counter at the top left of the screen, because that is how Wade survives a thing called a cataclysm at the end, which Sorrento sets off to just kill himself and everyone else. At least their avatars, to just kill them all off. But suddenly Wade is the only one left there because he had this coin given to him. He didn't even realise that it was an extra life, and he takes that and it says extra life on the back. That just permits him to survive this thing that kills everyone else. And of course, the principle that conflicts with is the principle of zeroing out and respawning. Because the idea is, if your character dies, you yourself in the real world don't suffer or anything, but your character loses all their possessions and can respawn somewhere else at their basic settings. And so the first model, you have a number of lives, is one where you can lose a game. The respawning one is one where you go back to a zero setting, but your character doesn't actually die. Your character just starts again at another point in the game, and so you're effectively immortal. Films seem to be very pro the earlier model of what you do in a game, because it's actually possible to die there. There was lots of implicit different accounts of gaming going on there, and I do wonder if there was also lots of implicit different accounts of movie going involved too. Are we stuck in a period where films, in order to count as blockbusters, have to be at least a little bit meta? Is there a level of knowingness now that filmmakers think that one must adopt in a blockbuster in order to make it a blockbuster, and that if it's not knowing, it's actually working outside the box? As if we had like a music industry where all you could ever do was just a cover of an older song.
It's a good question. I think certainly at the moment, in the light of Black Panther, which is breaking records all over the place, it's not really that meta. It's not really referential only to itself and only to Marvel in general, you know, the obligatory Stan Lee cameo and that sort of thing. It's fresh. It's not built on a whole network of the past, debris and bricolage of past pop culture. It's its own thing. I think it's surpassed some of the top grossing films of all time. Then you've got something like Ready Player One, which in a way, with Spielberg, it's hard to know, because 20 years ago he was that big name. He was that big star director that everybody turned out for. Jurassic Park, that was what, 93? Yeah. That blew everybody away. Well, most of us. It was the fresh thing because of what that film achieved with animatronics. I suppose this is something maybe Mark Kermode has talked a bit about. I think more in relation with The Post, which came out a while ago as well, is that with Spielberg maybe isn't the major box office draw anymore, because you just expect a certain level and there's less hype.
There's no need to big him up anymore, because its name's just instantly magic.
You just, right, there's a new Spielberg, I better go and see it. And it's interesting because this has come out in fairly close proximity to The Post, and there's such very different films. This one is so technically different. Spielberg was one of the people who was really staying with the older media for quite a while. It took him a while to go to digital, and There's been quite a bit of talk lately because Alex Garland's latest film Annihilation has come out and Netflix is distributing it. So it's got no theatrical release in the UK. You need Netflix to be able to see it. In interviews, Spielberg has said he doesn't feel that films distributed by Netflix and Amazon Prime and things like that should be eligible for the awards because they're essentially television movies because they've gone with that format. And yet this latest film of his is really opening out to the possibilities of motion capture. So much of the film is basically animation. It would be interesting to see exactly frame by frame what percentage of the film is animation rather than live action. A lot of it is motion capture, so it's both very often. It's part of a bigger general discussion about how cinema is evolving into these other areas.
You'd need a bit of insider knowledge to work this out, but it would be so revealing because you could do a graph which would be number of shots which show the real world, a number of shots which show stuff happening in the Oasis, and that graph would possibly be something like 30% of the shots show the real world and 70% show the Oasis. Then do a graph of how many hours of person labour time went into all of the work, not just principal photography, but all of the work, so all of the editing and all of the colour work, for example, and all the sound mixing. Work out how much of that work, how many hours of that work went into the shots of the real world, and then how many hours of that work went into the shots of the Oasis. The difference there would be much greater because a couple of seconds of completely digitally created footage takes many times the amount of work as shooting something for real, even if that thing you shoot for real involves sort of creating the set in advance. I can see that there's still a very Zemeckis feel to this film in that he's always been one to use special effects to show you things that are impossible. Well, impossible in the world in which we live. Obviously, they're completely possible in this story space. And that goes along with the idea that if you're going to spend on a particular special effect, spending on a special effect which renders itself invisible isn't what you should be doing. That idea is just a perception. I'm not saying it's correct, but that's a perception which is widely held. And so what do you use special effects to do? You use it to show things like force fields and people dancing in zero gravity. You don't use it to make a fire seem more fierce than it actually is, and so on, because those are uses of digital post-production which take your original thing, take the expenditure on the digital post-production and render it invisible. I always love to use the lightning from Back to the Future as the example of this. That special effects used to show something you ordinarily would never see, which is lightning doing its thing. Although of course the lightning it shows is magic lightning, basically. I think it uses the same technology as was used to generate the particle beams in Ghostbusters. It's lightning that rides around like a snake rather than connecting to a distant point. Anyway, I think that might be the end of stage one of this chat, as it is late.
A few other points of interest included the Oasis itself. I wondered where the novelist Ernest Cline got the idea for the Oasis, because the book was published in 2011, but the Oasis as an idea of an online place in which you can embody presence is explored in an episode of Futurama, specifically the season 2 episode A Biclops Built for Two, which first aired in 2000. This episode itself is strewn with references to gaming and film cultures and where these cultures converge. There's also a quest for identity and belonging, so it could be worth looking into in a bit more depth. I was also thinking about the time setting. The retro interest in 1980s popular culture in 2045 would probably be equalled by people in the 2010s obsessing over the 1950s. Perhaps if we look at the right-wing conservative nature of politics, I'm thinking mostly the US and probably the UK as well here, in the 1950s and the 1980s, there's much more to be mined there as well. And of course the 2010s are often bearing similarities with those decades. The joy all the references gave me matched my excitement at seeing Damien Hirst's Treasures from the Wreck of the Unbelievable exhibition in Venice last year, as it was such a thoroughly film and pop culture literate work. Perhaps some would say illiterate in terms of ancient popular culture, but I really love mashup and convergence culture, so I had a really great time. And I tend to find a lot of talking points in the problems that arise in Hirst's orchestrations. The problems in Ready Player One that we mentioned are a bit different than Hirst's ethical conundrums, and issues around representing gender, race, and the erasure of differently abled bodies is still too prevalent in broader film culture, and I really hope to see a movie that excites me that much again without causing discomfort in those kinds of areas. Thanks so much for listening, sharing and supporting. It's always very much appreciated. To be involved in a discussion about anything to do with the broad notions of audio and or visual cultures, you can find me on Twitter at PEA Blair or email audiovisualcultures@gmail.com. Financial support is really important as it will help me keep the recording ad-free and free to access. Any money received goes towards recording expenses. We're starting to have guests and it'll be nice to keep them fed and watered for their input and time. In addition to regular payments to Patreon, I do also accept one-off donations to paypal.me/PEA Blair, and that's where I'm saving up for new equipment and software to facilitate faster and better quality outputs. Thanks so much again and speak to you soon.